All right, so you ready to jump into this?
Let's do it.
Okay, today we're getting into something, well, it's a question that's been around forever. Do we actually have free will, or are we really just along for the ride?
Yeah, and it's a question with some pretty big implications, right? I mean, it makes you think about all kinds of things like the choices we make, how we judge each other, even our legal system, right?
Totally. And to really unpack all of this, we're diving into a conversation between, get this, two astrophysicists, Neil deGrasse Tyson and Charles Liu.
Yeah, and that's what I find so interesting about this. You might think, astrophysics, what's that got to do with free will? But they bring in this really unique perspective, this cosmic perspective, like, are there forces at play in the universe that might actually be shaping our lives in ways we don't even realize? It's fascinating.
Right, like how much is our choice, really? So to even start this whole thing, when we say free will, what are we even talking about?
All right, so basically it's that idea that we can make genuine choices, right?
Yeah.
We have this ability to act independently. Like, we're not puppets being controlled by something else.
Okay, so making a choice, like I'm choosing to use this microphone. But then Tyson, he comes in with this argument.
Yeah.
He says that the more we actually learn about the brain, the more we're seeing that our actions, they're actually influenced by all these things that we don't really control, right? Like our genes, our brain chemistry, even the bacteria in our gut. He says they all have a role in how we behave. It's kind of mind-blowing, right?
It is. It really challenges that traditional idea of free will that we often hold on to. And he uses these really powerful examples to illustrate that point. He talks about things like addiction, right? Or autism, epilepsy, even severe depression.
And he doesn't hold back on those really difficult questions either. Like he asks us to think about someone who's struggling with those really dark thoughts, those suicidal thoughts, and they feel this overwhelming urge to jump, right? Like if they give in to that impulse, can we actually say that they were free to make a different choice?
It's a tough one to grapple with, isn't it? Because it forces us to confront the reality that the brain, for all its complexity and awesomeness, is still an organ, right? It's subject to the laws of physics and chemistry, just like everything else in the universe. And those laws, well, they might actually be imposing limits on what we think of as free will.
It makes you think, right? Like, are we really calling the shots, or is there something else at play? But now Lou, he comes in, and he's not quite ready to give up on free will. He's got this really interesting idea. He says maybe it does exist, but it's just a really small part of all the actions that we take.
Right, like a tiny fraction of what's going on.
Right.
He even calls it a small percentage and says it's that little bit of free will that lets us do things like act with compassion or fight for what we believe in or make those decisions that push society forward.
So it's like, even if most of what we do is already determined by all these factors that we don't even see, it's that tiny bit that really sets us apart.
It's a fascinating concept, isn't it? It suggests that we might have more control than we realize, even if it's just a sliver.
I like that, a sliver of free will. But if that's true, it makes you wonder about a whole bunch of other things, right? Like how we approach crime and punishment, for instance. If so much of our behavior is shaped by things outside of our awareness, should we really be focusing on punishment? Or should we be trying to understand those factors, Rehabilitation, maybe? Looking at it through a more compassionate lens.
Absolutely. That's one of the huge societal implications this conversation brings up. They even talk about this concept called restorative justice, which focuses more on trying to repair harm and reintegrate people into society rather than just locking them up.
Yeah, which makes you think maybe our justice system could benefit from a little more of that understanding, right?
For sure, especially if we consider the possibility that free will, while it might exist, is way more complicated and nuanced than we tend to believe.
So much to unpack here. And it doesn't stop at the brain either. Tyson and Liu, they take this conversation even further, looking at how things like physics and even the way society is structured, how all of that might be influencing how we think about free will. It's like they're saying even if we could somehow map out every single neuron in the brain, we'd still have this massive question mark hanging over us, right? What about the universe itself? Because if the universe operates based on these principles of determinism, as some physicists believe, then could it be that our lives are already predetermined from the very get-go? No room for free will at all.
That's a truly mind-blowing concept to wrestle with, right? The idea that everything is predetermined. But then there's this other piece of the puzzle, randomness. Especially when you start talking about things at the quantum level, it's like the universe is constantly rolling the dice, introducing this element of chance that could disrupt even the most deterministic system.
Okay, so we've got determinism on one side, randomness on the other, and somewhere in between, this tiny maybe even an illusion, this thing we call free will.
Exactly. And that's where Tyson and Liu, they find some common ground. They both agree that this line between what's determined for us and what we actually choose, it's not fixed, it's constantly shifting as we learn more about ourselves and the universe. They actually have a name for it. They call it the perimeter of ignorance, which I love.
Yeah, perimeter of ignorance. I like that too. So it's like we're explorers, right? We're charting out new territory, but the map keeps changing as we make new discoveries. We might find out that things we thought we had control over are actually being influenced by things we never even considered.
It's a humbling thought, isn't it? What we see as free will today might be something totally different tomorrow as we uncover more about how everything works.
Right. Like what we think we know can change at any moment. So we've got this perimeter of ignorance, this back and forth between what we can control and what controls us. But now the conversation takes a really interesting turn. They start talking about the UT Austin shooting.
And it really makes you think about this whole free will thing, you know? I mean, this young man, he had a tumor, and it was actually pressing on his brain. Tyson, he brings that up as a possible explanation for his actions.
Right, like if there's this physical thing impacting his brain, how much control did he actually have? But then Liu, he jumps in and says, hold on a second, this guy also wrote this whole note before it happened. So now we've got this extra layer, right? If he was able to think ahead and plan and write something down, does that mean he could have made a different choice about the shooting itself?
It's like, does free will work differently depending on what we're talking about? Some choices are more influenced by our biology than others. It's a spectrum, right? Like on one side, you have those split-second decisions, those impulses, which might be more about our wiring. And on the other, you've got these thought-out, deliberate choices where it feels like we're really exercising our free will.
So we're talking about levels of free will. Some actions are freer than others. That's kind of wild when you think about it. And I'm guessing it gets even more complicated when you start thinking about mental health, right?
Absolutely. I mean, if a tumor can have that kind of impact on someone's behavior, what about things like depression or anxiety? Or even like personality disorders, it makes you wonder about how much control people have when they're dealing with those kinds of challenges.
Right. It's like maybe instead of just judging someone's actions, we need to understand what's happening in their brain, right? Their experiences, their genetics. It's not just as simple as saying someone's good or bad based on their choices.
It's way more nuanced than that. And that's something Tyson feels really strongly about. He says the more we learn about these influences, like our biology and our environment, the more compassion we should have for people who might be fighting battles we don't even know about.
It's like that saying, don't judge a book by its cover. But in this case, it's more like, don't judge a brain until you've walked a mile in its neural pathways.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the incredible complexity of being human, you know, and approaching each other with more empathy, more understanding.
So where does that leave us, right? If free will, if it exists at all, is constantly being pulled on by all these unseen forces, does that mean we're all just along for the ride?
The million-dollar question.
Right. But even if our choices are being shaped by things we might not be aware of, I think both Tyson and Liu would say that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to make ethical, thoughtful decisions.
We still have to own our choices, even if they're not completely free.
Exactly. And maybe, even more importantly, we need to create a society that understands those limitations.
Yeah.
You know, a society that actually supports people who might be struggling instead of just punishing them.
Which brings us back to that whole restorative justice thing, right? That seems even more relevant now.
Totally. Because it's not just about asking, okay, what's the punishment for this action? It's about asking what led to this behavior in the first place, and how can we address that so it doesn't happen again? Rehabilitation instead of just punishment. But doesn't that require a certain amount of free will? Like the choice to be compassionate, even when it's hard.
Right. It's like this weird paradox. Even our capacity for compassion, even our ability to make those choices, might be influenced by these same forces we've been talking about. And that's something Tyson and Liu, they don't shy away from that. They acknowledge that there's still so much we don't know.
It's like the more we learn, the less clear-cut everything becomes, right?
Exactly. And they even take it a step further. They start talking about medication, which I thought was really interesting.
Wait, what about that?
Well, they use the example of medication for anxiety. Like, if taking a pill can actually change how we feel, does that mean those emotions weren't real to begin with?
Whoa. Okay, so if a chemical can change our thoughts and feelings, what does that say about free will?
Right. It's like, are we making choices, or are our brains just responding to these chemicals? It definitely complicates things.
So the deeper we go, the more those lines start to blur, huh?
Absolutely. And I think that's both exciting and a little unsettling, don't you think?
For sure. So after all of that, where does it leave us? What's the takeaway from all this talk about free will and whether or not we even have it? I think that the biggest thing I'm taking away from all this is that there's no easy answer, right? It's not about saying yes or no to free will. It's about understanding that it's complicated.
Totally. And that's where that perimeter of ignorance idea is so important, right? It's not about saying free will doesn't exist, but it's about being okay with how much we don't know yet.
Right. Like we're still figuring this whole thing out.
Exactly. And as we learn more, we might discover that some of the things we thought we could control are actually influenced by, well, a lot of other things.
It's kind of like that saying, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know.
Exactly. But even if it turns out that our free will is limited, that doesn't mean that things like compassion and understanding are less important, right? If anything, it makes those things even more crucial.
Especially as we learn more about ourselves and the universe, right? Like if a lot of our actions are influenced by things we don't even realize, how does that change the way we think about things like crime and punishment?
Yeah, that's a huge question. Should the focus be on punishing people, or should it be on trying to understand why they do what they do? And how can we help people who might be struggling with those influences, especially if they're not even aware of them?
It's definitely something to think about, right?
Yeah.
This whole conversation, it makes you really question the way we see ourselves, the choices we make, how we treat each other.
It's not easy to wrap your head around, but these are the kinds of conversations we need to be having, especially as we learn more and more about the universe and our place in it.
It's like the more you know, the more questions you have, right?
Right, totally. So after diving into all of this, what really stood out to you, I have to say, that idea of a perimeter of ignorance, it really got me thinking. It means we're always learning and evolving in how we understand the universe and ourselves, right?
It's a pretty powerful thought.
Isn't it? And it makes you wonder, what incredible discoveries await us in the future? What might we learn that could completely change how we view this whole idea of free will? Who knows? Maybe one day we'll have it all figured out.
Or maybe we'll just have even more questions, right? But until then, it's all about being curious, being open to new ideas, and just trying to understand this crazy, complex world we live in a little bit better.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, a huge thank you to everyone for joining us on this deep dive into free will. It's been a wild ride, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into who knows what mysteries await.